welcome back to another episode of the Constitution at Work podcast, brought to you by the F.W. de Klerk Foundation, dedicated to making our constitutional democracy a reality for all South Africans. Now, today we are joined by a very special guest. We're joined again by Prof Anna-Mart van Wyk. Professor is a professor in the Department of Politics and International Relations at the University of Johannesburg, where she teaches courses in international conflict, international relations, arms control, and arms disarmament. She holds a PhD in history and is a former public policy scholar at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. She specializes in South Africa's nuclear history and has published widely on the topic. Prof, welcome back.
Thank you. Thank you, Ishmael. Thanks for having me.
To bring our audience up to date, throughout the weekend since we last spoke to you, a lot has happened in the field of foreign policy, international relations, and geopolitics, particularly the tensions rising in the Middle East, where we saw Iran retaliate against Israel. Prof, last time we spoke, you gave us a good sense of the scale and scope of nuclear weapons, as well as the potential consequences environmentally and internationally of nuclear weapons. Could you maybe touch on what has happened since in the Middle East and perhaps the defense mechanisms that these nations have to defend each other, like the Iron Dome? And also, Prof, do you think that nations these days prefer to have mechanisms like the Iron Dome because diplomacy is no longer working?
Thank you. Yes, since we last spoke, indeed, a lot has happened in the Middle East. That is a great cause for concern. I'm not at this stage worried about a nuclear war per se. We spoke about Israel having developed nuclear weapons and having a nuclear weapons arsenal, to which it has never admitted. But it is, it is wide knowledge, actually, that Israel, since the early 1960s already had a nuclear arsenal. Now, since the early 1960s, Israel could have used, some of its nuclear weapons in many of the conflicts that it has experienced since then, and it opted not to, because nuclear weapons is such a immoral weapon in a way. And I think in Israel's policies, it's more like a defensive weapon than an offensive weapon. So it is meant as a deterrent. But yes, it has the situation there has escalated massively with Iran that has retaliated against Israel. I mean, the scope of the attack, this is the first time that Iran has actually directly attacked Israel. And it went also over, of course, the sovereign space of other countries to be able to shoot all those drones and all those missiles in the direction of Israel. Now, the majority of those more than 300 drones and ballistic missiles have been intercepted not only by Israel's Iron Dome, but also with the help of Saudi Arabia, the UK, and the US. Many of those were shot down. So the Iron Dome, yes, I think in the contemporary world, I think it plays a very big role, as a defensive mechanism. It's nothing new. During the Cold War, the United States, for example, had the Star Wars program, which was, similar to the Iron Dome. And it was specifically aimed at protecting the United States against any intercontinental ballistic missiles that could have been shot their way, from the Soviet Union at that time. So, I mean, diplomacy, it's clear that the Middle East and the situation there, that diplomacy is not working. The United States, despite its warning to Israel, news that are filtering through is that Israel is planning a retaliatory attack against Iran, which will, of course, escalate the situation there even more. If you look at the Iranian newscasts or news broadcasts by the state media in Iran, Iran have said this was it, that this was the only, it wanted to retaliate, and this was it. They're not planning another operation. But one cannot help but wonder if this was just a test to see how Israel would respond and how strong, in my opinion, just how strong the Iron Dome is, and if it can be overwhelmed by, an overwhelming conventional onslaught. The one thing that also concerns me a little bit is that, the ballistic missiles that Iran shot in the direction of Israel is an all-generation ballistic missile. And yeah, if one goes and look at Iran's conventional capacity, they do have newer generation ballistic missiles. And yeah, the question is now, how far will this escalate? If Israel does retaliate, which seems very likely, it was widely believed that Israel would actually retaliate last night already. But I think in the next few days, we might see a response to Iran. And then the question is Iran going to respond with newer generation ballistic missiles? And, would that also include, and I'm saying this very cautiously because there's no proof that Iran has nuclear weapons, but, I am sitting with this question: if Iran retaliates with a new generation ballistic missile, would it include nuclear, which would, of course, have very, very bad consequences, not only for the Middle East, but indeed, for the rest of the world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's just shocking, Prof, because a lot of the more sensationalist news headlines that one reads points to the fact that we might be heading towards World War III. And I want to hear your thoughts on that, but I'm also struggling with the question that if we look at President F.W. de Klerk, he'd been hailed as one of the great peacemakers, along with President Nelson Mandela, of the 20th century, earning the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts in nuclear disarmament, partially. And I want to ask you, Prof, do you think that that was a once in a lifetime moment where we saw leaders rationally coming together at the negotiating table to bring about an end to a conflict, be it an internal conflict? And do you think that could be replicated in the Middle East? We speak of an increased state of belligerency among these two nations. What will it take for example, a Prime Minister Netanyahu and a President Abbas to follow the example of Presidents de Klerk and Mandela?
Yeah. I've been asked that question many times in relation to North Korea in particular. In South Africa, one of the reasons for the disarmament was, of course, a change in leadership in South Africa. But before I get to that, I think each case of disarmament is very unique. And I think there are a lot of lessons to learn from the South African case, but it's not necessarily, replicable to another state. There was a very specific set of factors in Southern Africa at play during the 1980s. That does not necessarily translate to the situation that the Middle East is currently. I mean, South Africa, as you know, was involved in a border war with Angola since 1976, right through to 1989. And by probably around 1988, there was, two very good conventional small armies, but two very well equipped conventional armies having a standoff and facing one another, by the beginning of 1988. So it was like it just needed a match, to be thrown into this pot of dynamite for that to explode in a much more regional conflict. But also we see in 1989, but that also had an advance already from 1988, that you see what was happening in Eastern Europe. There were the protests, especially starting in Leipzig, filtering out to the rest of Eastern Europe, Eastern Germany in particular, that ultimately led to the fall of the Berlin Wall. So if you look at the South African disarmament case, nuclear disarmament case, there's a few things that were at play here. Firstly, there was the New York Accords of December 1988 that brought an end to the border war and at the same time granted independence to Namibia. So we see that there was this phased, withdrawal of troops from both Angola and Namibia, both the Cuban troops and the South African troops. So that situation, improved. The second thing is that at the beginning of 1989, we see former State President P.W. Botha getting a stroke. And Mr. de Klerk then stepping in first as the acting president, but later on when Botha resigned, de Klerk became, the state president. And he had always had this belief that, the deterrent value of nuclear weapons was not applicable to South Africa anymore. He has claimed many times, and he's never wavered from this, that, he did not agree with the fact that South Africa had nuclear weapons as a deterrent. As the Minister of Minerals and Energy, of course, he knew about the program since the late 1970s into the 80s. So, but for him, together with that, there were also, a new group of leaders moving into the South African government at that point, together with him, that I would say was more liberal in a sense, but was not so security focused, as Botha and some of his cabinet members were. So this whole technocrat, securocrat thing that drove the Botha government, was almost turned a bit on its head when President de Klerk took over. And one of the first things that he did was to bring together a committee in November 1989 to investigate the disarmament of South Africa. So that was the second reason, to get back to the reasons for the disarmament, was there was a change, in leadership in the South African government that was very necessary at the time. The third thing, of course, was also South Africa was on its knees economically by the end of the 1980s. Interest rates were skyrocketing. There were all these sanctions against South Africa that placed a very big and heavy economic burden on the country. So yeah, I mean, something had to change in South Africa. And when Namibia gained independence, the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, and eventually the Soviet Union imploded. Okay, that communist threat against which the apartheid government developed, the nuclear weapons, was then removed from Southern Africa. So the external security situation in Southern Africa changed.
Yep.
And at the same time, President de Klerk also started, the negotiations with the ANC, which led to the release of President Mandela, or Mr. Mandela, who later became president, and so on. So you can see here, if you want to now draw it to the Middle East, okay, not all of that can be said of the situation in the Middle East. Yes, Israel do have nuclear weapons as a deterrent, but it's a different scenario. It isn't, the same factors are not necessarily at play there. Yeah, so.
And now you see the Abraham Accords as well, and you see the détente between some nations like Morocco, the United Arab Emirates, and Israel. And I hope that is a step in the right direction and averts a complete nuclear fallout. But Sia eagerly wants to ask a question.
Sure.
Mine actually leads to your statement and the reasons as to why South Africa disarmed. So could you really describe South Africa's journey to disarmament as one that actually hinged on human rights and especially that of life? And how would then that actually give South Africa a position, or not a position, but to use what is currently happening in the Middle East as an opportunity to actually step in as a norm champion in advocating the issues around human rights and the importance of disarmament? Thank you.
Yes, it's a good question, Sia. With a bit of a difficult answer, but again, it goes back for me, and this is just my own thoughts, right? I think with the change in government that happened in 1989, President de Klerk and many of the cabinet members that that became, or many of the ministers that became members of his cabinet, I think were a little bit more human rights orientated than the securocratic cabinet of his predecessor. And I think that definitely, made a difference. Secondly, I mean, he immediately started negotiations with the ANC, and also for the release of not only Mr. Mandela, but also a lot of other political prisoners. So I think he really wanted, to see a peaceful transition to democracy in South Africa. And yeah, I mean, it was basically after the nuclear weapons were dismantled in 1991, South Africa only admitted to the nuclear weapons program by 1993. And then we see the ANC coming in. And the ANC has always been very, non-nuclear orientated. So for them, it was always this thing that, for human rights to prevail, you cannot have a weapon, that is such a, thing that can basically destroy an entire community or an entire country or entire society, even if you want to go there. So that has always been the mantra of the ANC. And I think that combined with the first steps that Mr. de Klerk took, by taking the decision to dismantle the nuclear deterrent, by signing the NPT in 1991 as a non-nuclear state, and then coupled with the ANC's, focus in their foreign policy on human rights, we see that South Africa, as early as 1995, already emerged as a champion for disarmament, and specifically nuclear disarmament. So we also see that going into 1996, South Africa was instrumental in getting the African Nuclear Weapons Free Treaty signed, and it became known as the Pelindaba Treaty. It was also in 95 very, very, very much involved in getting the NPT extended, indefinitely. So yes, I do think that South Africa is taking a very strong stance for human rights in the Middle East situation. We all know what transpired after the past few months in terms of the case that was brought against Israel for the invasion of Gaza, and the whole World Court case that happened there. So yes, it is trying to promote the whole issue of human rights. And I think it does have a role to play as a mediator, between the various parties in the Middle East, if it would be allowed to do so whenever nuclear weapons might be introduced into the specter of things.
Prof, just to draw the conversation back to what you were telling us the last time we spoke, where you gave us a very great synopsis of the types and the scale and the size of nuclear weapons. And of course, a lot of those assumptions were made based on nuclear weapons that were either developed in the 80s or 90s. And you pointed out how different nuclear weapons are today, that the size of one nuclear weapon today is many times larger than the nuclear weapons that, for example, had been dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But we do live in the 21st century, and that brings about new opportunities and new problems, one of which is technology, specifically artificial intelligence. And do you think artificial intelligence has any role to play in security? And if it does, how to mitigate that threat?
Yeah. Look, any country that is not currently taking steps to guard against, AI in its whole security protocols, I think is not in touch with reality. We've seen more and more over the past few years, more and more how AI has been used, as a tool to disrupt, systems and that sort of thing. And it can be used as a weapon, very definitely. We've seen in the case of Iran, Israel has never taken responsibility for this, but there have been several AI attacks, in terms of worms, computer worms, viruses and stuff that have been released into the Iranian nuclear, civil nuclear program and that sort of thing that disrupted that whole program. So one of the older ones was called Stuxnet, which was also used to disrupt some of those facilities. So definitely AI is becoming more and more a weapon to contend with. It can be used as a tool for terrorism, but at the same time, the drones. The drones that have been used to attack Israel over the past weekend, that's AI. I've been watching some videos over the past week, of the new drones that America have developed that can take off from an aircraft carrier, and it looks just like their B-2 bomber, the stealth type drones that they are using now, and the advanced AI features of this drone, they can actually take, I wouldn't call it its own decisions, but can make, certain decisions when in a certain situation. Yeah. So I think, from computer viruses to the types of aircraft that we're seeing, to this new type of nuclear weapon that Russia has developed, which is like an undersea drone that contains, a nuclear warhead. And that drone has been tested in the, in the ocean north of Russia. So yeah, definitely AI is taking the world by storm.
Prof, the thing is, AI makes it very difficult if it lands in the wrong hands to pinpoint culpability as well, because you might have hackers in Russia and you can't really, hold the Russian state liable then for what a group of hackers have done in AI terrorism, for instance.
Yeah. Ishmael, I made the example last week in our previous discussion about, this cluster of warheads that the same can be said, and that could hit several cities at the same time, taking out the economic hub in New York, taking out the government in Washington. You can do exactly the same with AI. And I think the threat is even worse with AI than it ever was with ICBM. In literally just a click of a button with the right type of AI generated virus or something, you can take out the economic hub, the military hub, the government of the United States. You can stop entire electricity systems. You can stop water supply systems, to a city like New York. So yes, I think the threat with AI weapons is much more prevalent and a greater risk than I think nuclear weapons has ever been and will be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sia, any questions from your side?
I only have one. It actually revolves around South Africa. I just want to know, since we already know that South Africa has a nuclear facility, Kuwait, my question is, what happens to the nuclear waste? And does it have any implications for healthcare and environmental issues, especially for communities that are in close proximity? Thank you.
Okay. So the nuclear waste that comes from Kuwait, but not only Kuwait, also from, Pelindaba, where we still have a research reactor. But okay, the nuclear waste mostly comes from Kuwait. It goes to an underground facility in Vol Pits in Namakwaland, which is basically, in the Kalahari. So it's a very sparsely populated area of the country. Just like, the underground test site was in a very remote area of the Kalahari, they're also doing the same with the, with the nuclear waste. So at the moment, it gets buried very, very deep underground. So it doesn't contain an immediate, risk to any of the surrounding communities or farms. It's mostly farmland in close proximity. It's very there's not a lot of population there in terms of density. Yeah, so one of the risks is that it gets transported by truck, from Kuwait to Vol Pits. And there have been accidents because some of those trucks drive at night, and it's a gravel road. And so some of the farmers in the area have been complaining about the fact that there have been accidents with some of these trucks, and that does cause a bit of concern about radiation and how it might affect, agricultural land there and that sort of thing. Must remember that Kuwait operates on low enriched uranium. So the type of exposure that you would get from, from those nuclear waste wouldn't be the same as with a nuclear bomb. But, okay, it can still cause illnesses. It can still cause high levels of exposure that we do not want, that would pose a health risk.
Yeah. So, Prof, we can't thank you enough for giving us this wealth of information today, but a hypothetical to throw your way, if I may. If you were the Foreign Affairs Minister deployed by President F.W. de Klerk to solve the Middle East crisis, to speak to Prime Minister Netanyahu, President Abbas, what advice would you give them from a South African perspective? And what lessons do you think our listeners can learn from everything you've just said?
Very much maybe play as a foreign minister. I would make it very clear to somebody like President Netanyahu that given the history of the Jewish people and the Jewish nation, and in particular I'm talking about the genocide of the Second World War, going through, all of that, they should be very careful that they don't become the offender, or like the offender that did that to them. Mr. Mandela made a very, very good comment that's always in the back of my head that I think does have some value here. He said that if only the Afrikaner, and the ANC or the Black people in South Africa could have worked together from the beginning, we would have had a much different scenario in South Africa. He said, the Afrikaner that has suffered so much through all of the wars with the British, etc., plus the Black population of South Africa that have suffered so much. We didn't turn to one another in our suffering. Instead, a small minority took the power and became the person, the instrument of what was done to them. And yeah, Israel must be very careful that they do not follow that route. They all love that piece of land. Yes, the Jewish people needed a homeland. If you go back into their ancient history, they've always been there, but so have the Palestinian people. They all love that land. So instead of fighting, why not take up, an instrument of peace and try to live together peacefully? Well, both of them can cultivate the land. Both of them can, bring prosperity in that region. And I think that's what saddens me about what was happening in Gaza. Yes, Israel very much, had to respond to the attack that Hamas made against them. But if you look at the vast destruction in Gaza, it doesn't really weigh up for me in the way that the response could have been different. So yeah, I would really want to play, I think, that card to say and basically, play on the conscience of the Jewish people to say, but you've been through so much. Why then are you doing the same, to another people group? Yeah, I think that that is what I would want to say about that, and that I would want to passionately say. It doesn't help that you become an instrument doing the same thing than what was done to you, to other people.
Yeah, absolutely. Let negotiations be the instrument that brings about peace, and let the pen be mightier than the sword. Thank you for joining us on yet another episode of the Constitution at Work podcast. Today we were joined by Professor Anna-Mart van Wyk, a professor in the Department of Politics and International Relations at the University of Johannesburg. She enlightened us over this two-part podcast on nuclear disarmament, South Africa's role therein, the history of nuclear arms in South Africa, and the role that President F.W. de Klerk played, and gave us a brilliant wrap-up of global tensions in the world today, as well as how the world can learn from South Africa's lesson. Professor, we thank you.
Thank you very much, Ishmael. I very much appreciate the opportunity.